to our chat on the brave, not-so-new world of podcasting. We're going to be looking at all sorts of issues during this chat, whether it's issues of funding, commissioning, how the market works, storytelling. But I gather there are lots of different people in this audience who might have different interests. So maybe we could have a show of hands. Do we have any podcast people in the room? Over there. Just a couple of you. Okay, so we can talk rubbish and no one will know any different. Great. TV people in the room. Have we got any TV people? Yeah. So who are the rest of you then? Maybe we'll work that out as we go along. But what I was going to say that we want to keep this fairly informal, and if you want to butt in at any point, if you want to correct us, maybe keep that on the down low a bit. But if you've got something to say, or you just want us to expand on something, just put your hand up and ask in the middle of the chat, okay? We're going to keep it as informal as possible. So anyway, my name's Fiona Sturgis. Can you hear me now? My name's Fiona Sturgis. I'm a journalist. I write about the arts generally, a bit of TV, a bit of this, a bit of that, but also I write a podcast column in the FT. So my job is to be a real shit about all the podcasts these guys make week in, week out. But anyway, these guys are the real experts. So I'm just going to quickly introduce you to James, who is Mr. Spotify. we have Sophie from Acast. We have Steve from the production company Somethin Else. And we have Jason from the BBC. Now, I'd like to just go along the row, please, and you can tell us exactly what your job title is and what that job entails. Can we start with you, please, James?
Yes. So I've got the job title of Head of Partnerships EMEA, which doesn't really describe anything about what I do at all. Basically, I run podcasts in the UK. That's everything from our partnerships with people like the BBC and Acast and Audio Boom, etc., to all the commissioning as well in the UK. And I have a couple of people working for me as well. And then I also manage the broader partnership strategy for EMEA. So that's mainly working with public broadcasters around Europe or big media companies, working out how we can make sure they have the best partnership experience with Spotify.
Brilliant. Sophie.
I am the UK and Ireland content director at Acast. So we're a bit of a sort of a funny platform that lots of people don't know what we do, but we actually work with the majority of the kind of top UK podcasts. So be that from publishers like the FT, The Economist, The Guardian, or the biggest independent podcasts like the things that Something Else are producing, Adam Buxton, My Dad Wrote a Porno, if anyone's heard that. So what we do is we're a hosting platform, and we monetize podcasts through adverts and sponsorship. That's our fault, sorry. But creators need to make money. And we also market podcasts. So our job in the content team is sort of part account manager and part marketing and content consultant. So we are podcast experts. We are podcast geeks and proud to be so. So our job is to help you launch your podcast and make it as big and as brilliant as possible. And we work with everyone on this panel, which is great.
I'm Steve Ackerman. I'm the managing director of Something Else. So we, as a company, produce content across audio, TV, and social media. But a big focus of my role at the moment is our charge into podcasting and heading up all of our, all of the podcasts that we make for different varieties of all these people here. So some of our shows you may know include David Tennant does a podcast with. We did the first reality show, The Brights, and one of our ones that's doing very well at the moment is called Out to Lunch with Jay Rayner.
So I'm commissioning editor of podcasts at the BBC for Sounds, and it's important to say that I'm not the only person that commissions podcasts in the BBC, but I fundamentally focus on the new Sounds platform that the BBC launched last year, and also fundamentally my remit is to look at sort of distinct innovation in podcasting and try to sort of not replicate what networks do, but find gaps in provision for younger audiences, and that's kind of critical to my role. It's basically under 35s, and I'd say it actually skews slightly younger than that. So intelligent, engaging, entertaining speech for young people.
Brilliant. So I'd like to start about just talking about the market around podcasts and audio documentaries. Steve, I'd like to start with you. As an independent producer, you work for lots of different clients, and also you do your own podcasts. What would you say the market is like for podcasts at the moment?
fucking unbelievable. No, I mean it's a really amazing time because it's without doubt this is definitely the most exciting time it's ever been in the audio space, and really for the first time as producers there is a genuine market. You know, back in the day, if you had an idea for an audio program, really a radio show, you would have obviously gone to the BBC. Whereas now that isn't the case. So really the market, I think, really splits sort of two ways. One is what I would call commissioned work, so going to a Spotify or the BBC or Audible, who are all in their own rights very big commissioners of podcasts and programming. And obviously the other route for a company like us is to self-publish and just put a show out on Spotify and Apple and Acast and everywhere that we can stick it out and monetize it, working with someone like Sophie in terms of taking advertising and sponsorship. So it's a really, really vibrant time, yeah.
Okay, so Jason, the BBC has been for ages the dominant force when it comes to making audio documentaries. What is it that it's sort of been the big beast, but now BBC Sounds is trying to do something else. So what place does BBC Sounds have in this great new world of podcasts?
It directly follows from what Steve said, which is that there are no monopolies now, which is a really great thing. Monopolies really in areas of kind of creativity are not really nice places to be, and I think for a lot of the years, documentary makers really didn't have many people to sit down with, and now genuinely there is a market. You can go around and you can sort of do very different deals. And so my role really is in that market is to sort of be kind of agile in a way and come with a different sort of conversation that's been had to before. And also because of podcasts, I mean, there's just a creative opportunity, right? Fundamentally, I'm here to say that podcasting has changed the language of storytelling. I mean, that's really the most important. If I only to say one thing in this panel, it's just like podcasting has changed the language of storytelling. And that's where we start from. So what kind of stories do you want to make, and why would you want to make them with the BBC? The great thing for documentary makers is they can do many different kinds of stories and have many different kinds of partnerships. And we have one kind of defined, very public service idea of what we want to do.
Just out of interest, do you feel like the BBC was a bit late to the party when it came to podcasts?
Well, I mean, I'm only a year in post,
yes,
so
yeah.
I don't think the BBC was late to it. I mean, I think that it's just a complex. Look, I think radio all across the board's been late to it. In fact, arguably the commercial radio sector is the latest to it,
Yes,
fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
And I think they're waking up like massively, and they're going to have great impact. And it's a really interesting time in commercial radio looking at podcasts. But I actually fundamentally believe that if you want the truth is very obscure, but DAB actually created a blocker for the full on-demand revolution in radio or audio. And so we've just got over the DAB hump and realised that maybe that isn't the solution to all problems, and maybe the internet and on-demand is going to happen, and maybe podcasting actually are the forward march on that. And there we go, and voice happens and various other things. I just think actually it was a big industry structural thing that wasn't about the BBC.
I think the UK was late to the party because when you look at what's come out of the States and the fact that even now it's a much more sophisticated market. I mean, the other interesting thing from a market perspective is for the first time, audio is a global marketplace. Very similar, obviously, to TV and film and what's gone on there for many, many years. So for the first time, you can have an idea, you can release it all over the world, you can monetize it all over the world. You know, it's something that's definitely new for us as a business, that we're seeing direct revenues coming in from Australia or America or some of those places. And I think when you look at the UK industry, I think it has been slow. It's really moving quickly now, but there's no doubt about it. The US was out the blocks quickly.
Absolutely. James, Spotify has been shopping recently. So those of you, a lot of you may know or may not know that you've acquired Gimlet for, how much was it?
You probably have to find it out for yourself.
650 million something. I can't quite remember, but it was in the mega.
Punchy, but yeah.
It was in the mega millions, wasn't it?
It's 320 million.
Was it? Oh, okay. Okay. It was £4.99. Anyway, money is being spent by Spotify in the podcast zone. Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, that's a big question. So.
I mean, what made the market attractive?
Yeah. Well, so I was actually brought on Spotify to manage video and podcasts. So I don't know if anyone remembers that Spotify started doing video on Spotify around 3 years and 8 months ago. And we did. And it was kind of like short form clips cut down from popular shows. At the same time, we started dipping our toe into the podcast kind of ecosystem as well. And it was very quickly apparent, from a kind of UK-Europe perspective, that audio was what people came to Spotify for. They don't come for video. So it was clear that they wanted audio, they wanted more of it. So that was kind of an indicator of how we started getting into podcasts. And, you know, we've developed since then. We've obviously, you know, we've been testing different things. We think it's far from a zero-sum game, podcasting. Like, we're still at the very kind of start of it, and the audience is still, in terms of the broader UK media audience, very small. And I think we saw, and still see, a huge opportunity to grow that broadly for Spotify and for our partners as well. I think most of our partners who come on see Spotify providing incremental streams rather than any kind of replacement from other platforms. So, you know, we got to the point where we're testing with our own product, and obviously we're starting with originals, and then Gimlet, I think, globally, I think anyone in podcasting will tell you they probably have a reputation for some of the highest quality audio in the world. And our aim is to really kind of empower creators off-platform as well as our own originals. And we really think that one of the best ways to doing that is if we have some kind of best-in-class production capability. So it was Gimlet. It was also Parcast, who are an interesting US company, fairly new, and they have production in a completely different way. It's kind of much more I'm trying to say this in the best possible way. So Gimlet is all about really highly crafted audio, one-off kind of documentary pieces or 8-episode seasons. Parcast is much more about how do we speak to people 52 weeks a year, how do we create a show that is manageable, that is scalable across different countries. So that gave us that capability. And then we also got Anchor as well, which I think is one of our most interesting. So that's more of a tech platform which allows creators at any level really to engage with or to help create their podcast, and then distribute it more broadly. And it's everything from recording on your phone, editing, to distribution, etc. And we're hoping to build that out. So it's really a suite of tools that we think is a way to inspire kind of creativity in the marketplace, both on and off Spotify, frankly. I hope that wasn't too salesy, but that was, yeah.
Sophie, you are probably best placed of all of us to give us an overview on how the market's looking right now. Tell us it's good news.
It's great news. In terms of who's producing and who's doing podcasts.
Yes.
Yes, it's changed a lot. I've been at Acast for 2.5 years, and when I first started, it looked very, very different in terms of who was approaching us. So at that time, lots of the people we were working with were sort of what you might call like the bedroom podcasters, and some of them have gone on to make full careers out of podcasting, and that's amazing. We started to see lots of radio presenters come to us. That was quite natural. Like, they loved their main job, but they always had this thing, that this passion project they wanted to do. They're natural talkers anyway. And since then, we've just seen trend after trend after trend of kind of big names. So politicians, musicians, lots of influencers coming into the space, TV companies, journalists, and a lot of the people we work with they're amazing content producers in their own area, but they haven't got a clue about podcasting, and why would they? Like, how would you know how to put a podcast on Apple, or like what a trailer sounds like, or what good artwork sounds like? So that's what we've been doing. And then in terms of sort of the market, I mean, listenership every single month goes up, revenue every single month goes up. So it's a very positive time to be in podcasting. As someone who graduated and started working in magazines, it's quite nice to be in an industry like podcasting.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yes, I represent the death of the media.
Sorry,
and you are the life of media. Thank you very much for that. So actually that leads us quite nicely onto the next bit, which is about the audience. Obviously, you know, we get you get the sense from, you know, even from my sort of slightly removed position that the figures are going up year on year. But who are these people who are listening to podcasts? Yeah, so I think that it's just me and no one else is doing it. My mother still asks what's a podcast. So
it's radio, but on the internet.
Yes, well, that's what I try and tell her, but she doesn't listen.
So this is traditionally what it's been, but I think it's really changing. I'll kind of say why. So traditionally, it's educated, quite affluent. It was very male-dominated, but it's sort of started to come nearly 50-50 as more content is made that's kind of female-focused. The largest age group listening are the kind of 25s to 35s, closely followed by the 35 to 45. But interestingly, that 16 to 25 is the fastest growing because of things of, what Spotify are doing, actually what everyone on this panel doing, BBC, Something Else, just because the content that's out there for them, a lot of these influences. So that's traditionally who it's been, and that's great. But it's really starting to change. So we're starting to see things like The Brights coming out, the Made in Chelsea podcast, the Love Island podcast, Three Shots doing incredibly well, and they're really starting to change who is listening to podcasts. And my hope is that in 2 years' time, the question of who listens to podcasts will be quite an unusual one, like who watches TV. Yeah, because it'll be like, well, it depends on the content. So that's what I'm hoping will happen. We're not there yet. But what I'd say is that even in the time that I've been at Acast, it's changed dramatically. So hopefully that will continue.
That's interesting. James, your company must have done just a little bit of research before spending all that money. You must have known it was going to be a good investment. So what did Spotify's research tell you about the audience and audience habits?
So I think obviously we have the external research that everyone can see in terms of podcast growth, in terms of where are listeners coming from and kind of how are they spending their day. And I think there's been so much public data around that. I think the really interesting piece is how we saw our internal data. So obviously we know how many users we have. I think 217 million users globally. We can just see the potential as we create new discovery mechanisms, or as we kind of create new promotion mechanisms, we change the platform slightly, or even we do some marketing, we can see how much engagement we get from our audience. So I think, the potential for us in terms of why we did this is more about how do we engage that audience, how do we provide them with this content that they so clearly want, rather than yes, you can look at the external public data, but I think what's been the issue for probably all of us on the platform is how difficult it is to get that data, and how inconsistent it is between platforms, and it's so difficult to actually tell a story with podcast data. I mean, Jason's probably working at the BBC, probably got the biggest store of data of any of us, but it's incredibly difficult, right? Like, it doesn't
but you can have lots of numbers and they don't tell you anything. So there's a kind of naivety, even when it's fairly unclear around data. You can get the raw data, but it doesn't really tell you anything really that important. That's another journey I think all big organizations are going on, which is trying to understand what impact means essentially. What we know anecdotally, and I think even the raw numbers tell you, is that podcasts engender an amazing kind of loyalty, and people, I was told to say deep dive into subjects in a way that I think is quite unusual, just because of that little, who would have thought, like an RSS feed, like which was just built around blogs really. You stick an audio file on it and you just change one tiny thing, which is, it can be as long as it needs to be, and bang, you go on this kind of amazing evolutionary journey in storytelling where you can really, really engage in a story in a way I think that's been fairly unique. Long form has always been there, but essentially it's been in text, or it's been constrained outside of text, and audio has been able to facilitate that.
Yeah.
One of my most impassioned debates with other podcast listeners is actually that long form thing, because I think it just drives me nuts. People wanging on and on and on and on, thinking I have all the time in the world. It's like, yeah, but you don't have to use it.
Yeah, I mean, editing has always been a problem in our industry, but there's also I think for me fundamentally, if you understand the specific dynamics of podcasting and what's happened, which is, like, my dad wrote a porno, that couldn't have happened in any other form. I think that's just stopping and sort of recognizing that great creative endeavors have been enabled by such a simple changing in the parameters, and how the language has changed. So even the wanging on, for instance, which is wanging on has a niche, like that wanging on is really the kind of lifeblood of a ton of podcasts that can go for 3 or 4 hours. I mean, you look at some of the kind of, you look at the big titles in the US and you think, oh my God, it's like 2.5 hours per episode. How on earth? So it counters that media kind of assumption of constrained concentration spans and all that. But the truth is, they're just conversations that people wanted to have and do have in their real life, and they've been afforded a platform through that tweak in the algorithm.
At the BBC, the BBC has been losing its sort of traditional listeners on traditional radio. So how are you trying to move them over to podcasting, or are you anticipating?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's not about losing. It's just like radio behaviour. I mean, all radio doesn't have a default behaviour pattern. It used to. You used to basically have it bolted into your car or in the kitchen, and you grew up with the relationship. And now that the phone has taken over as the conduit for audio, you don't have that. The car's going to be disrupted. You won't have that. So essentially, just people don't have that default behavior, or if they have a behavior, they associate the behavior with what their parents listen to, and therefore there's a kind of reaction by younger people. But as you can see by the growth of younger audiences, literally make good shit for younger people and they will come. You know, make shit for younger people. That is where they are consuming stuff, and they will come. Like in Spotify, I mean, you know, it was a simple process at first, I think, for Spotify. You're just like, yeah, they're leaving the app. What are they leaving the app for? Oh, they're leaving their app to go to their podcast app. Let's put podcasts in Spotify, and they won't leave the app. And out of that grows a culture where Spotify understand content in a different way. So it's about re-engaging with people, and just the digital revolution hasn't really hit in audio those younger generations, and that's what's happening. That's the energy.
Do you see? Sorry, you carry on.
No, I was just going to say about the younger audiences, and kind of going back to your earlier point about the wanging on.
It's a great podcast.
Yeah. I think that, you know, oftentimes I listen to a podcast and I don't do much else, right? I'm obviously, like everyone else, obsessed with Have You Heard George's podcast? Like one of the most incredible works of audio art I think I've ever heard. And I couldn't do anything else while I was listening to that. It was half an hour where even if I tried to cook or anything, I'd just end up standing still in my kitchen. That's great for me, you know, that's kind of what I do, but I think what
George
we're missing
the Poet
out there...
burning down kitchens everywhere.
George the Poet burning down kitchens everywhere. But, you know, for some of our younger audience, we see that there is a 4 or 5 hour podcast on there, and the average listen length is like 4 hours, 59 minutes, 59 seconds, because it's not the same listening experience. They're with a group, they've got it on in the background, they're playing records over the top, whatever that is, right? And I think, so making all these different types of audio for those different situations, I think, is what is going to help podcasting grow beyond just people who've got a solid hour to sit down and concentrate on something. It's about, can we make it a communal experience? Can we, you know, make it a background? Is it something that is particular companion to a certain context? You know, I think all these things have to be thought about as it grows larger.
I think the counterpoint, I mean, you know, I think the sort of wanging on point is definitely true of lots of the more bedroom, kitchen-y podcasts, or podcasts that are maybe exploring a particular passion point, and it's just a few people in a room having a chat. But the other element I think we're seeing really coming into podcasting now is obviously craft. And nothing focuses you more than a program maker than the idea that someone can press stop at any time, which obviously they can't when they listen to a show on the radio. Or, I mean, they can turn it off, but, you know... But they're going to chance.
You should see how fast
work.
I move when the Archers comes on.
Yeah, same. So I think from that perspective, there is that mentality of thinking every minute counts, and ensuring that you know the creative joy is the fact you're not locked into a duration. If it needs to be 50 minutes, it can be 50 minutes. But if that week there's only good enough content for 30 minutes, that's also fine. But that focus on thinking every minute counts, and therefore let's make everything is brilliant. I think is something that maybe isn't so much of a pressure on for radio producing content.
Jamie from My Dad Wrote Porno says that if someone's going to dedicate 45 minutes of their life to you, you owe them the best 45 minutes you can give them, which I really like.
Absolutely.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, for the David Tennant series, if anyone's heard that, it's absolutely brilliant interviews. But each of those were about 2 hours worth of recording that we've chopped down to 35, 40 minutes. You know, just taken the absolute gold, and we've got loads of stuff we didn't use that's still brilliant.
Then there's a whole new podcast, The Offcuts.
We've done the best one,
So, Sophie, I want to ask you about content and what does work and what doesn't. I mean, we all have very ferocious opinions on that, I'm sure. But, you know, given that Acast is the sort of receptacle for so many thousands and thousands of podcasts, you know, you must listen to more than most.
Yes, 5 a day.
5 a day, alongside your vegetables, brilliant. So we're going to get on to playing some clips in a minute, but could you just give us a sense of, you know, for you, what's working, you know, in terms of genre, in terms of the format, the structure, the voices?
Yeah, so comedy has always been a big thing in podcasting. It's kind of been there from the start with the Ricky Gervais podcast. It still does really well, but it can be really hit and miss. So you can have a hit podcast with that, and you can also do a podcast that just doesn't do very well. But I think some of our biggest podcasts are ones that are comedy and it's a really strong format. So things like Off Menu is a really good example of that. These big storytelling podcasts, they are the type that do very, the Dirty Johns, Who the Hell is Hamish, Serial, not sure if you've heard of that. But those podcasts really are the ones that go viral globally. And as much as I hate to say it, obviously podcasters who come with a huge audience already, that naturally will do well. And again, interview podcasts that have found a really good angle, or that have David Tennant at the front. But things like Elizabeth Day's How to Fail, Dolly Alderton's Love Stories, they're an interview podcast, but they found a really good angle, like Desert Island Discs. They can do really well as well.
Oh yes, the Design Discs. Yes, that's been top of the charts. It sort of goes up and down, doesn't it, all the time?
Yeah, always there.
So you've picked a clip. Can we tee up Sophie's clip of the tip off? Sophie, do you want to just introduce the concept of the podcast, and then you can talk about what you like about it afterwards?
Okay, afterwards. So the concept, I'm a bit obsessed with this podcast.
It's amazing.
Does anyone know Maeve McClenaghan? She is from the Investigative Journalism Bureau, I think that's right.
Yes.
So each week she interviews a different investigative journalist about one of the stories that they have uncovered, and I will explain what's so brilliant about it afterwards, but have a listen. So what I love about this podcast, I think there's a kind of belief that to tell these big stories, you have to have huge budgets and a huge production team. You have to spend 2 years working on it. And that's true of a lot of these podcasts. But there are also really simple ways of telling big stories. So what Maeve could have done here is done it in an interview podcast, put out the interview, wham, bam, done, much easier for her. But what she's done is she's taken clips from the interviews and narrated throughout it. So she's made a storytelling podcast from an interview podcast. She never has to leave the studio to tell these huge stories. And yeah, I just think it's a really clever way of approaching storytelling and podcasting and just trying to think outside the box.
And it's also an interesting way of lifting the lid on an industry, isn't it? Because she is primarily a journalist.
Yeah.
And you understand about the things like doorstepping, or just the
moment
just
the wig falls
there's the sleuthing part of it. So
that's a really big theme of it as well. Yeah, it's amazing. It's a really good podcast.
So Steve, your company produces content across lots and lots of different genres. So, and presumably you have people pitching at you a lot and knocking people back. Just a little bit. So what have you learned over the last couple of years really works? And also I'd be interested to know really what doesn't. What are the slip-ups as well?
I think the truth is, first of all, we're still learning. I mean, our approach has been that obviously what podcasting allows is creatively us to really experiment in a way that's obviously much, much harder when, certainly from a commissioning perspective, you've got to go and pitch an idea and you're being given a check to sort of make that. You've got to make sure, obviously, that you come up with an idea that can appeal to a commissioner. When you're self-publishing, if you think there's a germ of an idea, I think you've got a bit more expression. And so we've really experimented in lots of different areas and different types of genre. I think it's definitely true that ideas that can repeat or are returnable are really, I think, quite crucial. I think it's much harder to be able to come up or to successfully do ideas that have a short run unless they are of the variety Sophie said of the sort of crime stories or stories that have a limited season but which can have a much bigger impact globally. I think the sort of the thing we'd really like to crack, which I might come on to a bit later, is I still think there's a long way to go in terms of getting a much wider range of voices across podcasting. It's definitely been, I think, quite a middle class thing up until now, and so there's a definite challenge there. I think the other thing we find that's sort of difficult, which Sophie alluded to a bit, is that basically every celebrity thinks they've got a podcast in them, and they just haven't. And so we have a lot of agents coming to us with, I've got this great idea, or my talent's got this great idea, and we've explored a lot of those ideas, but there's not very many that we followed through on.
Right, interesting. So you have a clip that you'd like to...
Well, so I'm going to give you an exclusive now. So the clip I'm going to play you is from actually something that's not out yet. So this is going to come out in the beginning of next month. You can see it's called Unheard, the Fred and Rose West tapes. What I'll just say as a precursor before we play the clip is, so it's obviously telling the story of Fred and Rose West, but what makes this interesting is telling this story is a journalist called Howard Soons, and he was one of the first journalists to break the story way back when. And so at the centre of the podcast, he obviously at the time, 25 years ago, was interviewing neighbours and all sorts of people who were involved in the case. And obviously in those days, as he was writing his notes, he'd have his micro tapes that he'd be recording the interview with. And so the podcast is centred around these tapes and the audio that came from these tapes that's being now heard for the first time. So the first voice I think you're going to hear on this clip is Howard, and the rest will become self-explanatory. So we've got, so we're telling the story across 12 episodes. Actually, very few of the episodes concentrate on the terrible crimes that were committed. But I think what makes this interesting from a podcast perspective is, first of all, those tapes at the centre of the podcast. That's not something that obviously could have been done as a TV, piece of TV content. The audio is absolutely the heart of the story. And I think the other thing is, and you get a little sense of it there, is across the programme, the other thing you really get a sense of is that life of being a reporter and trying to track a story and trying to find out the facts. When you bear in mind that in real time he's coming across relatives and neighbours and lodgers, but he's trying to understand what's gone on, because the headlines were there about the murders, but he's trying to get to the story behind, and that's really the story we're telling on these. So we go to the backstory of Fred and Rose in terms of their history. We obviously look at the case and what came afterwards. And we just try and understand also what happened in terms of the mistakes that happened, because all these girls went missing in a very small geographical space. And so how over 20 years was this allowed to sort of happen? And I think this, what I'm excited about in terms of this podcast is, even though for lots of people in the room, this story might be a fairly familiar one, I think especially amongst younger audiences and obviously non-UK audiences, we've got lots of people who've never come across this story at all. And even hearing it now, it is an extraordinary story.
As somebody commissioning podcasts, and if someone approaches you and they say, I've got a true crime podcast, do you kind of go, true crime?
No,
are we saturated?
I think if someone says I've got a true crime podcast, maybe. But if someone says I've got a great story, this came about basically because Howard and his agent came to us and he said, look, I think I've got something that could be interesting. He didn't really know what it was he had. The sort of layout he gave us for the podcast was really is not where we've ended up.
I'm asking in sort of more general.
Tell us what it was.
So he's a writer. And the way he'd ordered the story was thinking from a writer's perspective, really, in the way you do chapters of a book. And I know there are some similarities with podcasts, but we felt there was a different way to approach that, which I think is probably a much more akin to the way potentially a TV or movie maker would make it, in terms of you don't need to necessarily start at the beginning and end at the end, or you can deviate as you go through, and so I think I think the layout he had, something like 8 of the 12 episodes were going to be about the individual murders, and actually we only cover that in about 2 or 3 of the episodes, because we just truncate it all. We said, look, we don't need to get into all the detail.
Yeah.
I think with true crime, I think there's a lot out there, and I think we've got to be careful to kind of move away from the woman has been murdered.
The lady corpses, they're everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of that. And I think for me, the best true crime podcasts are the ones that sort of question why they're telling the story. Have they got some unique tape, or there's something more to say, or there's a reason to tell the story, like Teacher's Pet, he really felt that he had a reason to tell that story, or as well, you're bringing in, where possible, the family members and things like that. I think there's something to think about with true crime podcasts, for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. James, Spotify being the kind of the newest name in podcasting, you haven't got years of making podcasts and seeing what works and what doesn't. But how do you what's the sort of thinking about how appealing to young audiences? What sort of content do you think are you likely to concentrate on? Tell us all your secrets, basically.
Okay, yeah. For us, it's very much about it's been mentioned already, like diversity of voices, diversity of storytellers, allowing them to have their own voice on the platform, not trying to shape it into something that sounds like something I'd make. Like, what is their voice and what is the audience? And yes, they're speaking to a huge audience, but essentially they're speaking one-on-one to many people, not just speaking to a whole bunch of random faces. So, you know, it's very much about allowing them to have their own voice and encouraging them to engage in a kind of almost one-to-one basis with each listener. So my clip,
You have a clip.
yeah, demonstrates that. So what we did last year in the US and the UK was something called Sound Up, where, without going into too much detail, we basically got open applications for women of colour who'd never been involved in the media at all, and we just asked for a paragraph around an idea. And we've globally, I think we've had over 20,000 applications, and then we got 10 people in UK and US, and we flew them to New York and London respectively. And we put them up for a week, and we taught them everything about how to make a podcast, everything from the legal side to how to think about artwork to distribution. And then we kind of chose 3 of those kind of most developed ideas, and we've given them funding and further mentorship around how to make their podcast. And the idea was to increase that diversity of voices, increase those different types of storytelling that can then engage with all the different types of audiences we have on Spotify. So you
Should
can
we play
hear
the clip? Yeah.
the result of one of those winners from the US. So there you go. Basically, you can see they're explaining kind of what is a pretty difficult, challenging subject in terms of, you know, especially in the US, I think it's pretty highly charged. But in the language and the vernacular of the audience they're going for, young people basically. And they've had amazing reaction in the US. They've been on Ellen, they've had loads of press, and you know, the show's doing really well for us over in the US. And we've got kind of similar initiatives happening again in the UK, in the US again, in Germany. So I just think, you know, I think that's down to the whole industry really to think about how we can encourage those voices more.
Right, Jason, so you have a clip for us, and I think I do know this podcast.
You kindly reviewed it.
I did
Fiona,
very
thank you.
kindly review it. It's such a hard job sitting on my ass listening to stuff. But yes, so I know that when I first listened to this, I just thought it couldn't possibly be a BBC production. It just, you know, and I don't mean that rudely. That sound quite rude, didn't it? But you know,
I mean, it was actually a BBC production.
It
The
really was a
producers were in
BBC,
the
yeah. But it was, you know, I think it's sort of symptomatic of how you're sort of moving away. Does that sound fair? Moving away from the
It's the
traditional
first thing
markers.
we've genuinely commissioned, I think, and it has a sort of an arch. I'll talk about it afterwards, but it's NB stands for non-binary, so that's probably a very important thing to say about it, and then I'll let you listen to it. Yeah, it's insanely difficult to take a clip from that. I think the original clip was like 3.5 minutes, and I thought that was too short. That's, you know, wanging on. There's a lot of wanging on, but it's compelling wanging on. But so the project is about a journey of Caitlin, who you heard sort of reading the Hispithologist. I can't pronounce it myself. And Caitlin is basically coming out as non-binary. So they are going on this journey, and the end point is a kind of conversation with their father, and about that journey, and they've been joined by someone who is avowedly out as non-binary, which is Amru in the clip, Amru Al-Khadi, who's an incredible kind of writer and creator and sort of drag artist. And what starts out as a kind of very personal journey, like some of the personal moments in it are painful. There was a lot of tears, and my team cry a lot in the office. Basically, we have headphones on, and we just like tears going down our cheeks. But about sort of reorganizing Caitlin's marriage effectively, and all their relationships. We always struggle with personal pronouns, and that's part of the thing about personal pronouns. And it was a really interesting project for a lot of reasons, but partly because I don't think it could have been told in radio. Like, fundamentally, I'm at the BBC to do things that can't be done in radio. And this was one I think avowedly couldn't be done. It needed that space, and it needed a complexity. It didn't need balance, although when you listen to the whole piece, it's quite balanced because it's a kind of queer history. But yeah, it was a really... and it's also fun, I must say that.
It's
you must
very
say that fun.
it's joyous.
It's a lot of fun, right? There's a lot of
Absolutely
laughter
joyous,
and joy in it.
Okay, so moving on from clips for a while, I just want to look at, fairly briefly I think, how the finances work. I mean, essentially, how does commissioning work and how does the finances work? So how, if one of these guys wants to pitch a podcast, how do they go about doing it, and are they going to make a ton of money? I think that's what it comes down to. So James, could we start with you?
Oh, dear.
They've got lots of money at Spotify, we know that now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fairly simple, well, I'd like to say it was fairly simple, but, Steve might disagree. It's a fairly simple process for Spotify, I think. It's all about the initial idea and kind of the talent and how that works, and then our model is essentially we'll pay for production, and there's obviously a whole kind of commercial negotiation around that, and there's IP, there's derivative rights, etc. Just like in every kind of media world. I don't think we're particularly onerous. I think we're kind of open. I think obviously we're led from the US, but we try and make that slightly more European in how we think about deals. So I think we're getting better at that as well. And it's either full series commission or pilot, etc., and kind of extra revisions. So it is a fairly simple process. And then after that, obviously, there's sponsorships, host reads, and everything like that, which our sales team normally work on.
Right, Jason, on traditional radio, the commissioning process, as I understand it, is slightly long.
I mean, it's long anyway.
Slightly long.
Steve, the lines on Steve's face are actually from the commissioning system in the BBC. But it's a very complicated process. But I mean, just to represent what sounds and what this new kind of fund essentially is doing, set against the kind of a target audience, that younger target audience, and then these kind of ambitions around changing and doing different stuff, right? You basically have a kind of an application process, but you also have to register with the BBC as an approved provider, and that is just simply a very simple reason, which is like you're getting public license fee payers' money, and it has to be auditable, i.e. the minute the check hands from my hand to your hand, an auditor needs to come back and be able to trace that to represent the value and the commitments that you've signed against that. So there's a bit of kind of bureaucracy around that, becoming an approved provider. You have to be a company, so that's a really important thing, which is a lot of people come up to me at every moment in the day, in the toilet, in the lift, and they pitch a great podcast that they have, because everyone's got, everyone used to have a novel, now everyone's got a podcast, and they do that, and that's fine, but you need a production base, you need a company essentially. That could be you, and you could found a company, and people have done that. We've had conversations where we've commissioned things where people have gone off, created their own company. Or it could be that you go to something else, that we say, look, there's loads of great production companies out there. Go and have a conversation with someone like Something Else, and then they can pitch it in. There's lots of different kinds of conversations, but you need to have that sort of structure to be able to access the funds that we have. We've got, unless you're moving into drama, it's a documentary festival, but we have a drama brief out at the moment with a very specific kind of creative ask around it. And otherwise we have varying opportunities, and there's varying commissioners under Sounds, right? There's 5 Live are focusing on sport, very complex stories, some true crime stories. We've got Radio 4 trying to grow out other kinds of propositions. Radio 1, they're also doing sort of stuff around TV companion pieces and comedy. So there's lots of opportunity under the Sounds banner.
That sounds a bit confusing, though. So there's lots of people.
Commissioning BBC, it's always been confusing.
Yeah,
right?
well,
there's no difference. It's more fruitfully confusing now than it was before. It's non-monopolistically confusing.
Okay. Sophie, so Acast, I get a lot of people coming to me saying, I've got a podcast idea, what will I do with it? And I go, I don't know, I just listen to them, I have no idea. Go to Acast.
Thanks very much.
And I mean, I don't even get as far as asking them what the idea is. It's just pointless. But, Acast does churn out a hell of a lot.
Yeah,
so how does it work?
So we're sort of the opposite of these guys. So if you come to Acast, you're producing the podcast yourself, and you're funding that production. But like I said, our job is to host it and to market it, and then we insert adverts and sponsorships, and then we share that revenue with our podcasters. You own all of the IP, and that's kind of the benefit of our model. So it really depends what you are looking for. If you have the means to produce and you want full kind of ownership, and you can make it sound as you want that, and you want to make some money, then come to Acast. The money you make depends on how many listens you get. We can't work with everyone who approaches us, but for us, we have lots of different criteria that we base it on. But yeah, that's our model, and it means that lots and lots of people can make podcasts and make money from podcasts.
Am I right in saying it's more I sort of hesitate to using the word amateur, but I'm going to use it. The amateur podcasters, the bedroom podcasters, as you described them earlier, which sounds a bit sort of
no,
spicy,
actually,
but
it's not. We work with everyone from the amateurs to, like I said, the radio presenters,
yes, the established ones,
to the publishers.
But it seems to end up that a lot of the amateur ones would, I don't know.
They are more likely.
They're
to
more likely
to
to come to you
because they don't need to be a company.
Yes. Yeah.
We have a studio. It works really nicely for those podcasters, definitely. And they can also make money whilst their podcast grows. So to get sponsorship for a podcast, you tend to need to be a certain level. And so that, for a long time, especially in America, meant that podcasts that had a certain level of listens, they got sponsorship, and then no one else made any money. So the great thing about Acast is that you're inserting adverts constantly. So you're making money as you grow. So it's a really nice model if that is what you're after, and that's why we work with so many thousands of TV companies, publishers, journalists, radio presenters, musicians, comedians, everyone.
Steve, how do I pitch a podcast at you? I mean, I'm not actually going to do that, obviously.
I was going to get nervous there. How do you pitch you just get in touch with us? And as I say, I mean, we're talking all the time with people, and quite a few of the podcasts that we've either taken to, someone like James or Jason or colleagues, or the ones we've done ourselves have been collaborations where we've teamed up with someone who's walked in the door with an idea, like Howard and his agent, or the Brights that we've mentioned a few times, which is the reality series. We do that with Insanity, who are actually the company behind My Dad Wrote a Porno. So really, just get in touch with us, and we will always look at ideas, especially because there's just so much opportunity out there.
And how do you make it a success? I mean, again, this is a very basic question here, but you're quite
commercially,
commercially, yeah. So you're. I'm hoping you'll tell me a bit about social media here.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously the key thing commercially is it's all about the numbers. So when it works well, a lot of our podcasts we do with Acast, when it works well, it works spectacularly well in terms of the money that can come in is really, really, really interesting, maybe compared to the old audio world. But, a lot of podcasts obviously don't get to that level. And I think still at the heart of podcasting is obviously there's hundreds of thousands of podcasts, and there is a discoverability issue. The algorithms that we have are not as sophisticated and good as Netflix and Amazon Prime, and I'm sure for most people in this room, you're probably more likely to have listened to a podcast because a friend told you about it than because maybe you've seen it recommended, on a platform somewhere. So we think it's really important to be able to market the podcast and build a proper marketing strategy around the podcast, because fundamentally it still boils down to, can you get on the front page of Apple or Spotify to really get decent listening numbers? And so I mentioned at the start that we have a part of our business that in effect is a social media agency. It's about 30 people strong. And so when we're looking at a podcast, we're always thinking about what's the marketing that's going to sit around that, and that's going to be social media marketing, creating beautiful assets that can be sent out into the world to help promote it. It's PR, absolutely. We've ensured that a lot of our podcasts have appeared on Good Morning Britain, or just on the weekend, one of our podcasts got mentioned in a piece in The Guardian, and literally in fact, Sophie emailed me on Sunday, have you seen the numbers? Because, a 30% increase in the numbers.
Geeky stuff I do on the weekend.
Yeah. But that power of publicity is really, really crucial. And so I think having that built into the process, too many podcasters still think it's just a case of create a bit of audio and stick it out there, and the world will find it. And sadly, that just, that might be true for very rare podcast, but on the whole it isn't true.
And that's sorry to interrupt.
No,
that's a big part of what we do. Like, our job is absolutely to grow all of our podcasters because it benefits everyone. So for us, it's speaking to the platforms like Apple and Spotify. It's getting the press coverage everywhere, from the FT to the Guardian to ITV News, and then it's also cross promotions. We have a cross promotion scheme where we choose one of our podcasts each week and advertise it across our extensive network of podcasts, and that's just seen such a huge uplift because you're advertising to people who already listen to podcasts. You've not got that thing of like, oh, what's podcasts again? Yeah, no, I really need to get into those. Like, how do I download them? They're already listening to podcasts. They already like podcasts. And then obviously social media. And then the final piece I think for me is that thing of it's not just an audio file. So really think about your artwork, your descriptions, your episode release, getting a great trailer out, having the best launch possible. Episode 1 has got to be your best episode. Like, yes, podcasts grow over time, but really episode 1 has got to really grab you. There was one podcast once that didn't grab me on episode 1, and it took 5 people to tell me that it was really, really good and I should listen to it for me to finally go back and start listening again. So yeah,
we've definitely moved out of the naive phase. It's really important to say, and when that craft has come in, so people really are, people at the best end of the audio craft space are leaning in and making stuff. And I think if we're going to answer the American sort of the quality of American stuff, we have to really be great at that stuff. You can't be kind of average at it. You have to be fantastic
yes,
at
absolutely.
it. And that's happening. And then also, like I said, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, ideas that we take, isn't in that kind of very organic, very low down DIY market where on episode 165 it clicks, right? And bang, and you get mentioned in an article and everyone comes in and loves it, and you build you've built a community. We're looking for very cohesive propositions in a sense, and stuff that we can have an impact because of our particular strategic agenda, and whether that's Steve or myself or Spotify. So there's a bit of that naivety that's kind of gone, and it's really important for people to answer that. And even though it's complicated to pitch ideas, it's not as complicated as an Arts Council grant, because I recently helped somebody with an Arts Council grant, so it's not as complicated as an Arts Council grant. But there's a lot of information on the BBC commissioning site that you can really dig into, and there's audience outlines and strategies. We did a report on podcast drama recently we put out to give people a real understanding of what's happening in podcast drama, because it's really the next mega thing to go boom maybe in a year or so, and stuff like that. So there's information out there, and I think it's behoving on people to sort of bring their best game, to really think about whether the idea is suited to audio. Because
so that naivety you were talking about, which I still encounter a lot of people coming to me with their podcasts that they're not using production companies, they're not going to BBC or Spotify, they're just thinking they can do it at home, and they can put out a podcast. But I still get sent a lot of that stuff, and it's not necessarily very good. But do you feel that there's still a viable way to make podcasts? Because according to law,
No, absolutely, and you should. And we encourage that. I think we should do that. I'm just talking about why you enter, why you approach certain kinds of partnerships or facilitators, or why you would go to Spotify, why you would go to.
But 4 or 5 years ago, they wouldn't know where to go, but now there are obviously there are outlets that they can use. But is it feasible do you think now in 2019 to make a business out of a podcast and not to use any of you guys?
Absolutely. It's kind of like ideas don't come to our doorsteps to die. They have a particular life depending on the channel you take. Otherwise, you can really do it. It's a very different kind of journey, right? I mean, you might get lucky and you go bang, and you hit on something, and it goes boom. But otherwise, it's an amazing journey to go on. That's what the digital kind of revolution means. You can just do it yourself.
Yes. I think that's going to get harder and harder though, because we're now seeing so many big entrants come in, and they're making the same mistakes. I mean, interestingly, Fremantle just launched a scripted drama division and had their first release a month ago, which literally, I mean, try and find it. I mean, you genuinely can't. I just knew about it because I saw it in some trade press. So they're making the same mistakes that sort of smaller podcasters are making. But I do think because you've got so many bigger companies coming in now, and therefore the production quality is obviously raising, there's always going to be space for the bedroom podcaster talking about a really passionate subject, or there might be space for somebody who comes up with an innovative idea, but it's going to be harder and harder for that to, I think, rise to the top.
And do you guys look for the bedroom podcasters yourself and approach them? Is it a two-way street that you might go to them and say, yeah, you've got a nice idea here, but actually you're doing it, you're executing it really badly, let me help?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely done that, and actually the sort of tricky thing has been often that just isn't the aspiration of that podcaster. They're very happy getting an audience of sort of 5,000 a week, and that's kind of as far as it's going to go for them.
Yeah. Okay, I think we should open it up to some questions. Do we have any questions? Oh, we do have some questions. So there's a microphone coming round. So maybe the lady standing at the back there.
Thank you all, the panel. So I work in education. I work with 11 to 16-year-olds, both in mainstream schools and in inclusion and exclusion, basically, what's called pupil referral units. And I guess my question is, first of all, I think podcast is an amazing way of accessing certain groups that will not want to be filmed. And also you can't film in certain environments, i.e. criminal justice. And I wanted to speak, it's about, Steve, you were saying about the non-linear approach in terms of like the structural approach to things. In terms of commissioning something, like how do you all on the panel approach that? Like a series that is almost, I can't really articulate what I'm saying, it's almost like a non-linear, it's a series, but it's a non-linear approach. So it's quite like exploring lots of different issues, you know, in certain environments, you know, based on certain individuals you're working with, it can't be necessarily a linear approach. So I wanted to see your idea on that, in certain environments. And
Steve,
also, sorry,
Well,
and also on top of that, the remote idea, the idea of actually going into certain environments and filming remotely.
So in terms of the first point, I think for us it can't. I mean, to simplify it, it really boils down, I think, to two areas. One is either repeatable or returnable ideas, or the other one is evergreen content that doesn't date, and therefore it can be a 10-parter, a 12-parter, but it's going to have a really long tail of people who are going to keep coming and listening to it. And there's no right or wrong, obviously. I mean, both of those formats can absolutely work. You know, clearly for a company like us, we're absolutely looking at things that we think can win big audiences, and it could be either of those places. In terms of the remote recording, I mean, that, you know, I've mentioned a few times this reality series we've done, and that's exactly what that's about. And again, I think that's something we're starting to see a lot more of in the podcasting space than maybe we've seen previously in the radio space. Much more akin, I think, to what we've seen coming out of the TV world. So it's completely possible, and yes, I think it's very exciting that you can go into some of those spaces. And as you say, not having cameras is a lot less intrusive, and so you do get a very different response from people than when you have cameras around. I mean, in a very different way, we do a show with the food critic Jay Rayner, but we record it in a restaurant, and it's literally a meal. It's him and a guest, and the mics are hanging over them, but in effect they're having a meal together. And so obviously there's a different level of intimacy that you can get than if they were surrounded by a crew of 25 people.
I think as well, what all podcasts have in common is human connection. So whether that's you becoming emotionally attached to the story or the characters involved in the story, or emotionally connected to the presenter, like most people will say that they feel like the presenters of their favourite podcasts are their best friends, even though they don't know them. That is true for me. PJ and Alex from Reply All are my bezies, but they don't know I exist yet. So really, that's what's important to all podcasts, regardless of how you tell the story.
Has everyone heard George's podcast? Have you heard George's podcast? It's like a quintessential kind of, it's a tour de force of a kind of a narrative, of a very kind of non-linear narrative, essentially, where ideas can float in. It's very poetic. But I think not only is it a great piece, it's a pointer, I think. It wasn't made in the bedroom. They're not naive, and George the Poet is a household name. Like, he's very established, and he's got his craft. But it was made between fundamentally kind of two people, essentially, in a setup that you can find up and down the country in bedrooms, basically. A lot of music stuff related to audio that people can use. So I do think that it's a great example of where there's an amazing kind of opportunity. The next thing that we're going to release, actually, from my commissioning team is a podcast called After. And I didn't play any, we toyed with playing something, but it's a very delicate piece. It's basically a young rape victim going on journeys and doing interviews. Someone's recording now. Someone's making a podcast as we. Someone's just like, I've got it. Essentially, it's conversations with people who are survivors of rape. Okay, and we've created 2 episodes. So the same interview, but one is about then, and one is about now or after. And it's a non-triggering sort of idea, which is we wanted people who had encountered these issues in their life to be able to listen to all the kind of stuff about strategies to rebuild themselves without boiling them, getting them involved in stuff that would really trigger and stop them listening to it. So we've broken them up, and it's such a simple device, right? It's just an RSS feed, and we can put different episodes that relate to the same subject. So there's really creative ways you can use the simple facility of podcasting to break a lot of those kind of sort of usual assumptions about how you deliver things. Forest 404 is a really great example, I think, of where essentially the soundscape broke out as a sort of separate element to really what was a compelling drama, and that's because it had its origins in an open university idea. So essentially the science in the drama was able to live around these soundscapes. So there's great opportunities and sort of stuff happening in the podcast space that breaks down that and offers up great creative opportunity, I think.
Right, I'm going to move it on just so we can get some other... You were pretty fast there, the stripy top. Well, no, it's coming round.
Hi, I have a bedroom podcast interviewing women behind the scenes of the British film industry. When your listenership is still quite small, you're producing it yourself and out of your own pocket, what is the one thing that you'd recommend I do to kind of grow that listenership?
I would see if you can partner up with other podcasters who are sort of talk about similar topics and cross-promote with them. That would literally be my main recommendation.
Yeah, I think everyone we spoke to at Gimlet, everyone we spoke to at Parcast, everything that we see is that find your community of podcasters and can you guest on one of their episodes? Can you do a feed swap? There's a million different things you can do with other podcasters that cross-pollinate audiences and bring value across. And every single person at Gimlet, every single person at Parcast says that's the one thing to do to build an audience is build that community of podcasters.
I also just not make the mistake of thinking that you haven't actually succeeded in capturing everyone who's actually interested in that subject. It sounds really simple, but you could create a podcast that's really built for maybe 6,000 people in the UK and you're getting 6,000 listens. Like that, boom, you've topped out, you've won. If there's a subgenre gold Oscar, you're going to get it, right? So it's just about also being realistic about really the promise, because I think if you open it out and make it broader, it implies that you might actually change the kind of conversation and it change the podcast essentially.
Thank you.
Gentleman at the front here, could you pass that over?
Can you talk about, I mean, this is kind of a silly question, but can you talk about the optimum length or any insight you've got? Obviously, if something's good, people listen to it, but you must have an instinct, or is that changing?
No,
talk
I'm
about that a
kidding.
bit.
I actually get this asked, sorry, quickly, I
Okay.
get asked this all the time, and I think anyone who says, yeah, the ideal length is this, it's bollocks. Like, there is no definitive perfect length,
Yeah.
but I think it does depend on the content of the show. So a daily news podcast, not 45 minutes, no, like 20 minutes. An amazing storytelling podcast, more like maybe 45 minutes. An in-depth interview, you're kind of looking at a bit longer. A round table, probably about half an hour, but it really depends on the content. Like Three Shots again is another example of its
Yeah,
round table,
ridiculous.
but like it would
Ridiculous.
never fit into that time. So
No, and that yeah.
And
It's boring when
sometimes
people
it's
agree.
said that people listen to 90%.
Yeah.
Is that a
Depends.
really
Depends.
true
Depends.
statistic?
Depends. I mean, like I was, Three Shots, it's pretty much 100% every single week people listen to it, 100% of every single episode every single week, and that goes from 1.5 hours to 3 hours, 45 minutes. It's ridiculous. I think if we just did an episode every day, they'd listen every day. We'll maybe test that.
What about us late night listeners who nod off at the 20-minute mark every
Perfect. Still
single
playing.
time? Yeah, it's true. Not particularly with that podcast, but I find myself, if I'm listening too late, just listening to the same 20 minutes over and over again.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. So do you think that marks podcasts out from radio as well, because you're actually searching for the subject that you want to listen to rather than...
Well, I think it's
it being
interesting.
wallpaper.
So I think that also, as well, and this is just personal opinion, maybe that speaks also how people discover podcasts at the moment. Like, it's fine to invest 45 minutes in something if all your friends have told you it's a great idea. But if, we're experimenting with lots of ways around how to help or discovery on our platform and off platform. So one of the things we launched recently was a podcast playlist where, it's different episodes from different shows put into some kind of context, and we're experimenting with different things. Is it like you're commuting or you're running, or is it more about here's everything about a topic, or is it more about a genre like comedy or music podcasts? And then, again, when we look at the data and all that, and that, as I say, that's served to 217 million people, so we get some good data from it, is then will people take the risk on a 4-hour podcast, or if for discovery is it a different length? So I think yes, at the moment podcasts can be the perfect length for the content, but that's because of how the discovery mechanism is at the moment. I think so that might change going forwards around. It's very much about what people are willing to dive into and try. I think as discovery starts getting fixed.
Okay. Yes.
Conveniently, I'm next door with the microphone.
Yes.
Actually building on from that point, you mentioned that discoverability is a real issue and algorithms aren't quite up to scratch compared to some of other media. Just wondering, from a paid perspective, to what degree people can find an audience by investing in a kind of promotional plan on each platform, and whether that differs. Obviously, the massive, huge flyaway ones are heavily dependent on PR and shareability and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering, as a kind of a paid channel, where are we now and where's it going?
So we, on our originals, we do a lot of work with Acast and buying audio places on Acast network, for example. Obviously, we have our own marketing that on platform as well, so audio marketing that anyone can kind of get involved with, or banners that anyone can buy to promote their podcast, and we make good use of those. But I mean, the obvious thing, like has already been mentioned, is people are already listening to podcasts. Buy some slots around podcasts that are related to the genre you're talking about. So I'd say that's the single most effective promotional device. Obviously, Jason gets the whole of the BBC, which is amazing.
Not always, but I get to argue for some of the BBC. But I mean, it is difficult anyway, even if you have the BBC, because it's important to say in the UK we still haven't reached that kind of near 50% sort of mass mainstream flip that's happened in the US. And sometimes actually I think a lot of our content consumption is so US focused, we forget that the UK market is still growing and still fairly nascent. I mean, I can't remember what the last radar figure was, but it was something like 17%, was it?
Well, the radar one's lower, but but obviously lots of other research
is showing
18 to 20%.
Yeah. I was going to say, I don't even think we have a definitive marker against that, but I mean that's still amazing, right? And I think what's more important to say is that the growth has been really critical over the last few years.
But it shows how much bigger it can be.
Oh, I mean, it's a huge amount of ground to make up. It is becoming difficult to market stuff, but I mean, we're just facing the same issue. I mean, it's a maturing form, so it's facing the same issues, which is lots of people getting in the space. There's lots of great content, and you just have to target it. I mean, I think there's one thing that I suppose is inherently different in terms from my team, which is we really fundamentally look at the audience and then work backwards in a way. It's not that we don't have content expectations. We do. We really want to do certain stuff. We've got a public service remit, but we are also looking at who are we talking to, We're trying to understand the audience need at a particular time in their day or their week or overall or time of year, and try to build back from that. And if you do that wisely enough, I think if you really let go of your own ego as much as you can and make great shit for the right people, it can have its own organic kind of growth. But marketing, the BBC has noticeably become much more ambitious in terms of marketing, and also the Sounds app is a really important point of growing audiences for all podcasts. I mean, we'd like to think that Sounds is creating new audiences. Remember, there is the Heartland podcast audience, the people that read Fiona every week without fail, but there's also a massive proportion of younger people, as it skews younger, who really don't have a radio habit and don't have a podcasting habit, and really Love Island and those kinds of moments are turning audiences on in a kind of really interesting way.
Those companion podcasts are an interesting
real trend.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a Obsessed With, which is an interesting kind of we're dropping podcasts with big drama series around the BBC. So the Killing Eve just dropped. Won't give any spoilers away, but if you want to follow each episode and then follow an episode of a podcast, there's a great deep dive, and we did it with Line of Duty. I was just saying that Chernobyl, I'm sure everybody's seen it, it's fantastic. The companion podcast, the podcast is equally fantastic. So you're getting double the whack for your money, and it's really interesting because it's a kind of factual podcast around a drama piece, because it's such an important, complicated piece of Russian history and recent history. It's great to sort of get hold of all those kinds of facts that informed the scriptwriter. So it's a really interesting space.
Let's see if we get a couple more.
I also wanted to really quickly, just mention, I don't think it hasn't been mentioned at all so far, but the importance of YouTube as well to podcasting. Often people say their primary listening platform is YouTube for podcast. They just have it on in a browser window, and that is also a really good tool for marketing. Is it the full episode? Is it clips from the episode that are then pushed around other YouTube videos, obviously using Google AdWords. There's a million different ways to use YouTube, which none of us have mentioned so far, but I think is super important.
I have 2 really quick facts.
Really fast.
Really fast. One is that our latest research found that 1 in 3 people in the UK listen to a podcast every month, but most interestingly, 21% of those said they'd started listening in the last 6 months. The second is that quite a few of our partners have started trying out with billboards and seeing how they work. I know Spotify have done that as well. The Guardian, for their Today in Focus, targeted their billboards. So they just did London and they did the Tube, which is when most people are listening Today in Focus. Anyway, it's a commuting podcast, and they found that was really effective. That's my 2 facts.
Let's get those. Yes, you had your hand up. Last question, I'm afraid. Really sorry. Yeah, make it a good one, right?
Well, I just wanted to ask about the viability of content and discovery on smart speakers, and whether it's a bit different, whether you have faith in them as a platform, and so on. Any thoughts about that?
James just made a noise, so I think James should answer that one. He just said,
Well, I personally have got one, and I was really enthused about it to start with, but I find discovery incredibly difficult on them. And even when I know what I want to play, I find it takes far longer than just going to my phone and just unlocking it and pressing play. So I think there's a fair way to go before we find the kind of magic use case for smart speakers. And our data shows that, I mean, I don't know, maybe Acast data says something different, so they might contradict me here, but there's not that much listening from smart speakers yet. Like, they have a consistent listener base, but it's not kind of taken off the way I think you'd believe if you read the press.
I think it depends if you're kind of like a feature provider, or if you're sort of the news. If your podcast becomes, one of the news options, then we've seen a really big uplift. I think that it will kick off in a year or 2, and I think there was loads of excitement about a year ago, and it wasn't quite what we imagined, but I am sure it will come there. And I also think it's slightly interesting for the older generation who perhaps don't quite know about like how to download an app, or I was showing an elderly relative just say, hey, play me the Gary Lineker podcast, and it started playing. So I think there's something there. I think it will be great, but we're not quite there yet.
Oh, I think the spectators, that's a very particular audience.
Right, yeah.
yes. Okay, I think we're done here. Thank you very much, guys. Hope everyone's learned something.